Welcome everyone to Circle Back to You podcast. I'm your host, Jason Wilson. Our guest today is Carol Banens. She's a certified grief educator and grief to gratitude coach. She offers compassionate support with practical tools, guiding grievers to rediscover purpose and joy. Her transformative journey began with the loss of her husband in 2018, leading her to a profound exploration of grief that uniquely shaped her approach to helping others. Welcome everybody to Circle Back to You podcast. I'm your host, Jason Wilson. Today, I'm back with our friend, Carol Banens. Welcome to the show, Carol.
Thanks so much, Jason. Nice to be back.
Yes, today is Friday. Thank God. This week has been awesome, though. We're still recovering from the Freedom Fight Expo, which was a wonderful event. Carol, you did such a wonderful job at that event as well.
Thank you so much, Jason. It was such a pleasure to be included and listen to all the wonderful speakers you had.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, so Carol, what are we going to be talking about today?
We are going to be talking about grief misconceptions because they really affect how we grieve. And the reason is because we don't talk about grief, except now that you're giving me the opportunity to do that. But, society doesn't like grief. That we don't like death. And I think particularly in North America, it's very sanitized and we're uncomfortable with it. It's taboo.
Yeah.
So when somebody finally dies, we don't really know what to do, what to expect. Nobody else does. And so they come up with these nice little platitudes like the first misconception is, it just takes time. Well, does it just take time? The answer, of course, I'm going to say is no, right? But yes, it takes time, changes it. Of course it does. But there is no timeline for grief. We can't say at 1 year you will be back to normal. First of all, if somebody you love has died, your normal is different. You're not going to come back to that normal pre their death. So there's that. But the reason it doesn't just take time is because we all have different backgrounds and different things that affect the way we grieve. So we can't say yes in 1 year and 2 year and 3 years. David Kessler says acute grief is around 2 years, which I think is surprising to people.
Yes.
And the statistic for if you've lost a significant other, Jason, is 5 to 8 years to come back to some sense of normalcy. And I can remember hearing that and thinking, whoa, gosh, that's a lot. And yet I'm at 6 years now. And honestly, it wasn't until about 4 years that I started to feel, oh, I'm coming back to myself a lot longer than I thought. So what are the sort of things that can affect us and why it takes time? Well, your relationship with the person that you lost, had you been married for 50 years? Were you close with them? Were you not close with them? Were you estranged? Of course, that's going to impact how we grieve and how long we grieve. What was your mental health like prior to their death? Were you somebody who had depression, who had anxiety? Well, imagine what grief does to that. It amplifies it.
Right.
What sort of support do you have? Excuse me. Do you have those around you that can lovingly hold space and be supportive? Or are you on your own trying to cope with this grief? So when we talk about it just takes time, if you think of having a flat tire in a car, you don't sit in the car and hope it reinflates and just wait, right? You have to take some action. So you either call CAA or you get out and change the tire yourself, which of course I've never done, but you do something to move forward. And I think that's what we have to understand with this misconception is it doesn't just take time. It takes time and an active participation by the griever. So that's what I would say for it just takes time. It really doesn't. And I think it's really sad that we think that if we just sit down, it will get better. It doesn't just get better. And when I talk about an active participation, what I mean is that we mourn, we outwardly mourn, we talk about our loved one, we get out of bed, we finally go to the shops, we get back to work. This is sort of actively allowing your grief and integrating it, which we can talk a little bit more about. But I think the other thing, the next misconception is that grief follows nice, neat stages. And I'm sure that if anybody here is grieving, they've Googled grief. I know I did. I go, how long will this last? When will it be over? When will I be better? And what always comes up first are the 5 stages of grief. Have you heard of
Right.
those, Jason?
Yes.
Yeah. So the 5 stages of grief, which are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance, were put out there by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who is very famous for these 5 stages. But what people may not realize is she was actually interviewing and speaking to the terminally ill when she wrote about these stages. They weren't
Mm,
ever for the griever.
right.
And I can remember going on to Dr. Google and looking at these, thinking, "Well, that's wow, gosh, I'm not in denial. I was there. I know that's happened." And the interesting thing about denial, and I didn't really understand it at the time, is that our brain has a brain map for our loved ones, and it always expects them to come back. It expects them to be somewhere close by. They'll
Mm,
be here in a minute. And so when we're in denial, it's our brain having to come to terms with they're not here, they're not close, and they're not coming back. And that takes time for different neural connections to happen. And so sometimes you might be walking down the street and you see someone, you think, ah, there they are. And
right.
it isn't them, right? But it's your brain which is working on information that it had in the past and predictive, and it isn't them. And so that denial is something. So I think the problem when we see these stages of grief is we look at them and think, well, I'm not in denial, I'm not angry. And some grievers, of course, do have anger. They're angry at the medical system, they're angry at their loved one for leaving them sometimes. By the way, if that's you, that's normal.
Mm,
Some people feel anger, I didn't. And so you start looking at these 5 stages and thinking, I must be doing my grief wrong. Why aren't I angry? And start looking for places, excuse me, for where you might be doing your grief wrong. And I think at the worst time of your life, the last thing you need is to think that you might be doing your grief wrong.
right.
It's,
I'm so glad you brought that up because when my mom died, and she was my best friend, by the way,
yes.
she just wasn't
Yeah.
my mom.
Yeah.
We were really really close, and
Yeah.
when she died, of course, I wasn't in denial either. As a
Yeah.
matter of fact, she had a stroke, and that was actually her second stroke,
Right.
and she died of an aneurysm. So, but before that, she was so unhappy and so miserable because after the first stroke, she couldn't walk, she couldn't talk. And I said to the Lord, she has no quality of life. I prefer her to be with you.
Yeah.
And so that's why, I was actually at peace when she died. But just, getting going going through the whole process and getting to terms where I was accepting that she was no longer around, it took me a good, I would say, probably 2 years, but it didn't hit me until Mother's Day, and I couldn't
Yeah.
pick up the phone and call her like I usually did.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
yeah, I wasn't angry either. So you make a good point that I two of those 5 stages I didn't
Didn't
even experience.
didn't apply to you. And I think,
Right.
people may go through some of these stages. They may go through all of them. And they may be in a completely mixed up order, and they may be going in some at one point, it's some together, but it isn't a linear thing. And I think that's, if only it was, if only we could say in month 1 you're going to feel this, and in month 6 you'll feel this, and by 1 year you're better. And that's just not how grief is. We do have to experience it. And I think that then leads into the next misconception, which is really society driven, is you should get over it as quickly as you can. Like, just get over
Mm,
it, move on, get back to normal.
right.
And I think, because again we don't chat about it, what that means is there's a misunderstanding of what normal is, because you're different after someone very close to you has died. It's a different normal. It's a normal without them. So we can't get back to what it was. We have to now create what's going to be our new normal.
Mm.
But, here in Ontario, where I live, bereavement leave is 3 to 5 days. Now,
That's all.
imagine that's all. So, imagine if your husband or wife has died or your child. You have 3 to 5 days and then you're
Mhm.
expected to be back to work. Well, how can that possibly be okay for anyone? Um, and this is only for immediate family. So you may have a very close relationship to a friend. Sometimes our friends are like family,
Yeah.
and they die. You get no bereavement leave because, well, they're not immediate family. And so
Mm.
it's as if we don't respect death. We certainly don't respect grief. And it's like, let's just get through it because we're uncomfortable. We don't want to talk about it. We'd rather stand away and just come back to normal. Just let's pretend it didn't happen. And I think this is really harmful for grievers. I think it opens up talking about grief in the workplace. How do we modify return to work? How do we have a supportive atmosphere for people so that they feel okay maybe coming back for 1 or 2 hours? What do they need to support them? We cannot rush our grief. There are
Right.
certainly ways for us to move through it with a little less difficulty, but we do have to experience it. Because somebody we love died, let's face it. If somebody has died that you've loved, it doesn't stop you loving them. You still have love for your mother. She's not
Yeah.
physically here, but you have that spiritual connection. And I feel that
Absolutely.
with my husband. I mean, just because he's not here doesn't mean I don't love him and don't miss him. Of course I do. And
Hmm.
yes, it's easier with time, but to be rushed through it, it's almost like you invalidate their life. It's like, let's just move on. Let's move on. And I think as we move on, I would say the next misconception is, as you get back to some sort of normalcy, you won't feel grief again. And that's not true either. Let me ask
Right.
you, how do you feel on Mother's Day when it comes up? Every Mother's Day now since your mum died.
Well, the thing is that every single day, Carol, I think about her every single day, and not a day goes by I don't think
Yeah.
about her. And when Mother's Day come, I still get a little sad,
Yep.
but I'm able to get through it because I
Yep.
have my wife, and
Yes.
she she's the mother of my son. That's how I get through it. But
Yep.
still, it's a little
It's
sad for
there.
me.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So, it's 6 years now. Most people go, "Well, you must be good now." Yeah, yeah,
yeah.
mostly I am good. But there are these things called grief bursts. And this is when grief washes over you like a tidal wave. And they happen really often at the beginning where people just, they could be driving along and they all of a sudden burst into tears and feel this awful grief. Or they might smell a scent or listen to some music. Certainly for me, Brian was a jazz pianist, so any tune I heard that was his would set me off. And,
Mm,
and these still happen even at 6 years. Much, much less often, like barely at all. But occasionally they do.
right.
And it surprises me. It surprises me. So I think we have to understand that grief, Dr. Alan Wolfeld says it companions, it's a companion. We have to befriend it because we bring it with us. And for those of you who are grieving and listening, I think it's really important to understand we might bring our grief with us, but our life can expand around it.
Yeah.
So the grief right now might be filling, if that's life, your grief is this, but gradually life sort of, expands around that grief. So the grief is there. And it comes up every now and then. Actually, I think this is a good time. Let me read a poem from my book
Sure.
because I think this one, let me see, I marked it. Is this the one? Yeah, here we go. I'm going to read this because I think this is an important one. Okay. Stop fighting me. Hello, dear one. I'm your grief. And I want to be heard, to be listened to. Oh, I know you'd rather not. That's why you distract yourself. Keep busy. Drink a little more than usual. Anything but tune into me. But I have something to say. It's normal for you to hurt like this. When you've loved, you'll grieve. I want you to feel the pain of loss, to experience the absence, to explore memories. I want, in fact, to be your companion in life. You see, I'm here now. I can't be pushed down or pushed away. I can't be ignored or postponed. I'm now a part of you, a friend of sorts that travels each day just in the background, but there nevertheless. So, dear one, stop fighting me. Allow me to be with you. Acknowledge my presence. Know that I'll soften over time and that every now and then I'll just whisper to you to remind you that I'm here.
That's
So,
beautiful.
thank you. So, I don't think we have to get over it as quickly as possible, even though that's what, of course, we'd all love to do. We'd love to say,
Yeah.
I'm done, I'm done. And I think, you can move the timeline along with the right support and the right knowledge, right? If you understand what you're feeling is normal and it's expected, then you can sit with it a little easier, I think. I
Yeah,
think.
another thing that I think helps too is changing your daily routine,
Mhm.
especially in the case where you're in a relationship with a husband or a wife that has passed, and you did certain things every single day with that person. Well, now you need to change your routine. What are some of the things that you changed?
What did I change? I can tell you what I told my client to change the other day because I think that fits in even easier. She said one of the hardest thing was coming down to breakfast and sitting in their breakfast nook to have
Mm,
breakfast. And I said, well, why don't you change where you eat breakfast, set a beautiful place in the dining room, have the sun coming through the windows and do that? And she said, oh, okay. And I asked her the following week, how was that? She said, yes, it was different because
mm,
you're now not doing that. Sometimes people will sit, seeing the empty chair of your loved one can be pretty difficult. So you can even
yeah.
try sitting in their chair and looking at your chair. She didn't like that, but it's
Mm,
different things. What did I change for my routines? Um, I'm not sure I did because I didn't understand it. I wasn't a grief coach at the time. I was just a physical therapist, and I was completely floored with the lethargy of grief, with the
mm,
exhaustion from looking after Brian, a sick mother, a friend with Alzheimer's, trying to work. After he died, I could barely get off the sofa. I was exhausted. So I think my
mm.
routine was that,
Okay.
unfortunately. Yeah. But yes, certainly changing your routine. If you always went on a walk together, change the route of your walk. If you always listen to a certain type of music, maybe change that. But little
Mm,
things to start creating your own routine, your own life without, because it's
yeah.
difficult. You were a we, you were together, and now you're one, and that is challenging. It is. Um,
Absolutely. So, well, in the case where you lose, God forbid, you lose a child,
yeah.
and you still have your child's room decorated with all their toys and whatnot, do you advise a person in that case to get rid of the toys and redecorate the room?
That is such an interesting question, and I think everybody's going to have a different view on it. I haven't had to deal with that, but I think if we keep the room as a shrine, leaving everything exactly as it was when that child died,
Uh-huh.
I think you are, and I'm a mother. I understand where this comes from. You're clinging on to this and you're not in acceptance of what has happened. And I think
Right.
truly the only way that we can start to live our lives is through acceptance, self compassion, and gratitude. And so, can you change up the room a little bit? Make it, you could still have things, but don't have it exactly as it was. Maybe take photos, maybe keep certain ornaments or special things or stuffed animals. But I think if you keep a room exactly as is, as it was when your child was there, every time you go in there, isn't your heart going to break every single time? Not that it's
Right.
not already broken, but broken a little more. And if that keeps on for years and years and years, I suspect what's happened is that you have not come to a place of peace. And that's hard, of course, but
Yeah.
certainly accepting that they are not coming back and that they were not their room. There are so many other memories, and I think that's maybe where we would work is tell me about your child. What else about your child could we keep as a memory? Could we do a scrapbook? Could we do a photo album? Could there be a display of their favorite things, but not keep the room with the same duvet cover and the same curtains and the same color paint? Could we change it up, but still respect them and their loss? I think that's a really hard one for people. But
Yeah,
I think
that's a
I think it
that's a
keeps
hard.
them clinging to the past.
Yeah, absolutely. I think another thing that is really, really hard to get past is the anniversary of their death.
Oh, that was it totally is. I was going to get that was one of the other ones. People often say,
Mm,
just don't think of them. Keep super busy and you'll be fine. Well, no. Again, somebody you've loved, whether it's the David Kessler calls it the deathversary, the anniversary of their death, whether it's their birthday, Christmas, Easter, Hanukkah, any Father's and Mother's Day, all of these days are
mhm.
days where we usually do things with family or loved ones. And so they really can bring up grief. I know that for me, the week before any of those dates, basically his birthday and the day he died, I can feel it in my body. Like the body remembers. And I can feel that I'm a little bit off. I'm not quite, I don't feel quite
Mm,
right. The day is never as bad as the lead up, but that's my experience. So, what can we do? I think it's important to honor that person. Certainly, initially, the first year, I mentioned my husband was a jazz pianist, and for his last
right.
concert, when we knew it would be his last concert, we recorded it. We were going to make a CD, but he died before we could do that. So I actually made a
Mm,
CD of his last concert, and I had it sent out to all his friends and family and fans and things. So on that very first
mm,
anniversary, when everything feels really awful and really clear and really raw, I wanted to be alone. I wanted to really sit with my grief. I wanted to feel it. I wanted to listen to his music, that CD especially, and just let the tears flow. And that's what I chose to do the first year. Now, the years subsequently, I spent it with one of our dear friends on her deck, drinking Prosecco, talking about Brian. For me, that was a way of honoring him. And at 6 years, I'm at a place of I can look back with gratitude. Not so much in that first year, it was really
mm,
hard. And I think we have to plan. I think if you can think of ways to honor them, some people may want to go to the cemetery. Some people may want to light a candle. Sometimes you
yeah.
just want to talk to somebody about them, somebody close that knows about them and tell stories or look at photo albums. Some people bake a cake on their birthday. I didn't do that. For me, it was about music. And every year I listen to this very particular CD. It is really hard for me to listen to it. And I love his music.
Hmm.
But he was his music, and so for me it goes right into my heart and soul, and it feels like it breaks all over again. And yet I do it because he was such an important person in my life, and I want to remember him, and he was his music. I want to remember him, so that's how I do it. But everybody's
Right.
different. Everybody's different, but I think we should celebrate people. They meant something to us. We shouldn't invalidate them by just, you know, losing them. Years ago, that people used to say, well, you just have to let go. You have to sort of cut the cord, do that. But we know now that keeping a connected bond is actually healthier for us. Because how do you cut somebody out? Your mother, who
Can't.
was your best friend, you cannot do that. You
Right.
just can't. So rather than spend the energy trying to do that, why don't we spend a little energy thinking, how can I remember them with love, with gratitude? More challenging for people who've had difficult relationships, of course. If there
Mm,
has been any abuse or estrangement, then maybe you need to talk to a therapist or a counselor to really go peel back those layers and figure out what you need to grieve. Sometimes we need to grieve the person that we wish they had been. If
mm,
you had an abusive partner, maybe you really have a lot of anger, but maybe you can grieve, well, I wish I'd had a partner who was. But that I think you have to work through with a therapist.
Yeah.
Um, the other misconception is ignore your grief. Just ignore it. You'll get over it. Yeah, everyone gets over it. And true, actually, most people do get over their grief. Not get over. Most people learn to integrate their grief into their life at some point.
Uh-huh.
But we don't really get over it, do we? As you say, you think of your
No.
mum every day. But I'll bet now that you're at a point you think of her with love, with gratitude for the relationship, for all that she brought to your life. And I think that's our job as, as I work with clients, it's how do you bring that love and that gratitude and integrate it into the loss, into the grief, into your life so that you can actually move forward with life, but bring them with you.
Right. What I do is usually I'll have this conversation with my son because when she died, he was small. He was only 4 years old, so his memory of her is very faint.
Yeah.
So I'll bring up something like the way she used to laugh. I mean, her laugh was so infectious that you had to laugh too.
Yeah,
So I'll talk about things like that, and that's gratitude. It's fun,
it
and
is.
yeah, and that's
It's a
that's the way I
beautiful
prefer to
way
do
to remember. And
it.
here's the thing, when we're told to ignore our grief, aren't you better at yet? Aren't you over it? Somebody said that to me at 6 months. Are you over your grief? And I thought, no, I'm not over my grief. And here's the thing, when people expect that of you, we tend to think, well, I better push it down. I better just, I won't show them that I'm unhappy. I'm not going to show them that I'm sad. And as we push down all those emotions, we also push down all the emotions of joy and other emotions. I didn't know that until I finally sought help. And I said, I just feel flat all the time. Nothing really makes me happy. And she said, well, of course not. You're pushing your grief down. You've done that for 3 years.
Mm,
Oh. And so the other thing to note about this is, because again, I'm going to come back to society expecting us to get back to normal. 10% of mental psychiatric illnesses have been attributed to unresolved grief.
mm,
That's because we push it down. That's because we don't know how to cope with it, how to
right.
talk about it, how to support people so that they can know what's normal and not normal and live life again rather than having to sort of hush it up. And I think that's a really sad one that, people expect us to ignore it and just bounce back. Some of the things I've heard people say, uh, you know, aren't you over your shit yet? Not to me, but when I've done posts on and I'm thinking, people say that? Wow.
Mm,
I was lucky. I had the best friends and beautiful, supportive friends, but
yeah.
we cannot ignore our grief. So those are common misconceptions. That goes with keep calm and carry on, doesn't it? Very English. Don't show your emotions, just keep going. And that's what I thought I had to do. And
Mm,
it didn't, I burnt out. It didn't work out well for me.
right. Well, I think it's beautiful that you've turned all of that into coaching other people. I
Yeah.
think that's powerful in itself. So
Thank you.
yes. So Carol, let's talk about your book. Where can people find that? And
Well, I'm going to hold it up.
what's it about?
It's called Kintsugi Your Heart, The Art of Living with Grief. And kintsugi, for those of you who don't know, is the Japanese art of putting together a broken pot with liquid gold. And so, as I was grieving, I thought, ooh, 3 parts, you're shattered, your heart is shattered. Then it's just
Mm,
in pieces. And then as we put it together, we're making broken beautiful. So it's in 3 parts. And I didn't write this until last year, at 5 years after Brian died.
oh
I'd
wow.
never written poetry before, and this was me expressing those emotions that I had kept down for so long. So it's all grief poetry, taking you right from that moment when I said goodbye to him, right to the more positive hope and growth through grief. Can I read one more? And it's
Absolutely.
about pushing your grief down, because I just don't want people to do that. I want to give you permission to grieve. So
Sure.
fermenting grief. The temptation when in so much pain is to push it down, ignore, distract, Try and relegate it to a dark corner, but there it will sit, grief fermenting, bubbling away beneath the surface of your life, seeping into your cells one by one, until the lid can't be kept on it any longer. It is released with such force that you don't know what hit you. It was the grief you tucked away to deal with later, but now grown, expanded, stronger. The answer, dear one, is not to resist these painful feelings, but to do what seems perplexing, and that is to allow. Resisting leads to persisting, a burgeoning grief. Allowing, surprisingly, lets it soften, lose strength, until it becomes bearable. So
Wonderful.
don't push your grief down, anybody listening. So yes, the book's available on Amazon, Kintsugi Your Heart, The Art of Living with Grief. Just look up my name, it'll be there. And it's on Audible as well, Audible, paperback, and Kindle. So all of those.
Wonderful. Now, you also offer groups, support groups for people that are grieving.
Yes, so I have something called the Grief Cafe. Actually, it's next week. It's the first Thursday of every month at 9:30 EST. And Jason, I don't know if you've got the link there. We can put the link in,
Yes.
or you can go to my website, which is right there, and you can click on that. Come to the Grief Cafe. This is a free group where you can just come and tell me about your grief. It's not coaching, but we can talk about questions that come up for you. And if you're there, it's a safe space. There are only grievers there. So if you need to tell your story again, you can do that. And I also have, if you go to my websites, a couple of free things you can download. But if, I know people are struggling. I know how hard grief is. And if you feel like you're alone and you don't know what you're doing, reach out to me, email me. You can get the link on the website and we can have a chat, schedule a call. And of course, I have coaching. So if you are ready and you need a compassionate hand, then come along and we can have a chat about that too.
Great. Thank you so much, Carol, for being back on the show.
You're
We will see
welcome.
you again next week.
I think you will. Yes. I can't remember what we're talking about, but we'll talk about something good next week.
Yes, absolutely. So, ladies and gentlemen, have a wonderful weekend. We will see you again next week at 10 o'clock Eastern on Friday. Have a wonderful weekend. Take care.
See you then. Bye bye.
Bye bye.